Hello, hello. Welcome to Friday night, the 1st of May 2020. This live stream, Sylph Dominic Hawkins coming to you from the dojo. And I'm just going to give a couple of minutes to let everyone jump online and join the video. I hope that you're well. I hope that it's been a good week. Since I got to communicate with a whole bunch of you guys on Wednesday at our awesome Wednesday night meditation and philosophy and breathwork video, which was really good. I really enjoyed that. Hey, Ruth. Welcome. Otherwise, it's just been the Friday and Wednesday sessions. I hope that you've had a good week prior to that, back to Friday last week, when we sort of ploughed into discussions around the 4 fundamental phases that Hoshinden is built on. And we're going to be moving forward with that tonight. I'm quite cold tonight, as you can see. I hope that you guys are well rugged up at home and warm, and that you are ready to go, and you've got the heater on, or a nice cup of tea, or a hot water bottle, or a jumper, or a yak, or something. Before we actually move on, hi Stacey. Before we move on to the topic for the evening, quick little shout out that today is the 1st of May 2020. That makes it the Writing Spirit Dojo's official 11th birthday party. Woo! Hi Lisa, welcome. Writing Spirit Dojo turned 11 years old today. Ta-da! So it was only fitting that even though it's cold, I came down to film in the dojo in front of the Kamidana. Those of you who were with us last year for the 10-year birthday party, it was awesome fun. It was really good. We invited everyone to the dojo, put out sushi and platters and food. We had movies on. Hi Travis, welcome. We had movies playing and some speeches and probably a good, I can't remember, maybe 100 odd people. Students from the past who came and a really good opportunity to just reflect on the previous decade. So a year ago at the dojo's 10th birthday party, hi Stephen, I certainly didn't think that we'd be right here in this circumstance a year later, but nevertheless, here we are, and here we are together, and nothing's particularly changed at its heart. You know, the interest and the goals of the dojo's purpose hasn't changed. Its purpose has always been to facilitate growth and learning, and to act as a vehicle for transpersonal development for its students and members. And the art as an entirety lives for that purpose. It's to assist us in being able to strategize correctly by learning about the different ways that the qualities of life manifest and how they interact with each other. There you go, elevator pitch. So if that's really at the core, that doesn't have to happen in a building. That's not something that we have to be here or else it falls apart. You know, hopefully you are finding that at home, in your own lives, in your work, in your families, in your finances, in your homeschooling, for those of you that are raising your kids at home, you're finding that there's strategies at play and you're able to move things around. You're able to find things, especially because under these circumstances, and no doubt you'll be butting heads up against each other with loved ones, wives, husbands, housemates, children, etc. It's a really good time to reflect on whether our usual approach is actually helpful, whether it's actually going to be doing anything for us in the long term, or if really our usual approach is just kind of keeping us where we are. And if that's something that we want long term, we should reflect on that. So happy birthday, Writing Spirit Dojo. Woo! 11 good years. And that marks coming up my 20th year, which I think, I get very confused. I think 2001, so 2021, so next year will be the official year that I've been studying for 20 years. So this must be my 19th year. I think I just keep rounding up. So, with that in mind, we never wanted enough time to join on. Let's get started with tonight's topic. Before we get into discussing the rest of the primary, secondary, and tertiary phases in Hoshinden, I know I started last week and and we were discussing, I was giving the backstory about the 4 primary elements and some idea and some ideology around how was it that I actually developed that. So giving you some history and some stories about the progressive development. I want to continue tonight along that vein to discuss where we started with water kata in 2014 and how it was that led to the exploration of fire kata and then wind and earth. And then from that, we built into, it was a jump then from the primary elements to a kind of joining up one of my physics theories about repeating patterns in the electromagnetic spectrum, joining that up with a question and an experiment. And the question was, can I demonstrate that movement carries with it an inherent quality in relationship, in context, to a fixed object? So I call that fixed object north. And what you'll notice is, those of you who were around in 2014, I talked about north a lot. And in my writings, my digs, even the kata, north is referenced a lot. So north is meaning the object of relation. So I'm not talking about the global magnetic compass. I'm talking about if I'm facing someone, then I'm going to call that arbitrary north. If I'm facing the door, that's arbitrary north. And my question was around, could I say that movement itself, different types of movement, either moving towards or away from, yeah? Could I say that movement itself in that context of a fixed point, fixed relation, is expressive of qualities? And can I tie together those qualities with other phenomenological qualities of the universe and its manifestation? So the qualities of different manifestations of matter and phases, the qualities of the human emotional experience in relationship to sound, different combinations of sounds, different cordant and discordant relationships. Could I tie that together with the human interpretation experience of colour, of light, and then colours, and how those colours cause and evoke an emotional response that is different? So that if I'm looking at an entirely red wall, does that generate a different experience for me than if I'm looking at an entirely blue wall? And could I actually map those differing emotional experiences of the red and blue wall to, say, for example, the sounds of different keys in the audible music spectrum? So could I map the red wall to the sound, the emotional experiences, rather, that come from listening to a piece of music that's written entirely in the key of G major or G minor? And could I then map the different relationship between the red wall and the blue wall to a similar kind of experience between music that's written in the key of G major and music that's written in the key of, the key of E major or E minor? And then that question expanded further into the movement practice to say, okay, and if so, could I then say, well, could I map the experience of the red wall and the blue wall in relationship to the change of emotional experience in physical movement? So if the red wall causes me to let, and this is just arbitrary at this point, if the red wall causes me to want to move towards it, or it generates a certain emotional response, and the blue wall kind of has like a certain emotional experience of aversion, could I say, well, look, I can demonstrate through movement in relationship to this fixed context and point. If I move towards that point, or I move away from that point, can I evoke different emotional experiences in both myself and, if it's the case of an individual, like a person, in them? If it's the case of a set fixed object like a table or a couch, then it's me that I'm observing the experiential change in. And then mapping those together under a question that says, is there a fundamental universal mathematical pattern and methodology to the way that the differing qualities that make up the rules of interaction and the rules of three-dimensional space on a kind of, philosopher's stone is not quite the right term, but on a level where I could use it to actually then, as a test, take people through that experience and observation, bring them into a room with a red wall and get them to make notes about their emotional experience. Compare that to me playing them a particular piece of music that's written in a very particular key and getting them to record their emotional experience. Getting them to jump on the mats and interact with me in a very specific way around in terms of very specific techniques and phases of qualities of movement, and then get them to record their emotional experiences. And if I do that for each of these, would I find any kind of correlation? Would I actually find that yes, I can say, you know what, there is something similar about the colour red and the emotional evocation for the human in relationship to the musical key of G. And yes, that is also in relation to a very similar emotional evocation to when someone moves towards you. And so I know it sounds like they're very basic building blocks. My goal was looking like, could I break this into a really simple experiment effectively? And that's how that began in 2014 to keep building on that. Hi, Hannah. To keep building so that it could actually be a vehicle to answering that question. Now, what happened over the time is that obviously as a martial art, it also involves just standard repertoire, sounds funny, of classical taijutsu from self-defense perspective. So it kind of has this mixed meeting point where it's still continuing the tradition of teaching particular techniques from a physical defense perspective and in interaction with humans. So it's like those techniques are still the same. It's still about people being grabbed from the wrist and being grabbed, being pushed, being shoved, being kicked, being punched, being held in certain ways, grabbed at the throat, grabbed at the lapel. So those things were all there, and it took a long time for me to consider how would I build the question that I had into the martial arts study, but still around these basic entries, because this is just the reality of physical interaction. You have to be interacted with in a certain way, and there's only a finite number of ways that you can be interacted with. So human culture found out millennia ago that there's only a certain maximum range that the wrist rotates. And if you take the wrist beyond that rotation, well, then it starts to affect the skeletal structure and damage the wrist. So that's just the way that is. We get like a finite relationship. That means that if someone grabs my wrist, there are a finite number of answers or options. And obviously that plays out through just the tangible physical martial arts. What I was more interested in was if someone grabs my wrist and I move in a particular way, I either attempt to move away directly or move away to the side or move away diagonally or move towards them directly or towards them but to the side or towards them diagonally. If I do that, does it change the dynamic? Does it change both the experience that I'm having emotionally and the experience that the other person is having? From a martial art perspective, does it then, and this is where I started to develop that language, does it then begin to enter into a question about advantageous and disadvantageous relationships? So that it's like, biomechanically, from this particular angle and the way that grip is held and this particular way that the thumb works, then this forward movement against that direction, or towards the north direction, is going to impede on the thumb's ability to maintain grip and therefore cause the grab to lose strength. So the answer, effectively, what I started to discover was yes, of course. It seems logical. It was just good to ask the question. Yes, there are more advantageous. There are ways of responding that are more and less advantageous. I was like, oh, good, tick. Try to go through a scientific approach with it. Now, one of the questions that came up early on with Hoshinden was we had this 4 fundamental element system: the earth, fire, wind, water, and then spirit was kind of like a misunderstood concept. So we obviously inherited that from the Hoshinden Jutsu and the Hoshinden Jutaijutsu as just a fact of being one of the descendants of that methodology of thinking. And because what I wanted to do was explore that further, one of the things that my physics theories and research around the visible and the audible spectrum came to, when I was exploring in my other work, applying things like natural ratios, so golden circle ratios, and natural averages and means, the arithmetic mean, the harmonic mean, the geometric means. These mathematical functions that we use to observe the beautiful curling of leaves, or the way that the hair grows and curls, or the relationship of distribution for the length of the arms and the legs, of the torso, the body over the overall height, right down to the cochlea of the inner ear being a Fibonacci spiral relationship. It was like, okay, well, there's all these natural mathematical patterns that seem to have relationships for humans. And my question was, do those patterns cause our actual experience of, emotional experience, but our experience of intangible, non-tangible qualities such as beauty and love and value? And so part of the question was like, if I took 2 colours, I take the colours red and green, and I put them together and I explore, do I and other people, just the people I ask around me, do we experience a sense of beauty with those colours? If I put green and red next to each other, is there a sense of something binding those colours together beyond just the fact that they're colours? And then replicate that experiment with like, if I do that with other things in society that are well known, certain colour, the art world has done this for thousands of years. There are colours that work well together, and there are colours that you just want to throw up when you see them. Yeah. Musically, there are tones that are accordant and discordant, and there are tones that work together in a way that cause a certain emotional response, and there are chords that work in a way to evoke a completely different emotional response. And so we know that. It's more about whether or not that could be mapped to recurring, consistent patterns that we could access and then utilize for that purpose in other ways. And what I started to find was, as I took my work further with the electromagnetic spectrum, my relationship of the 1 octave of the visible light spectrum to the 10 octaves of the audible spectrum for human hearing, and I found that yes, if I take green and red, myself and a whole bunch of other people that I question on me have some sense of connection there. Oh yeah, they're beautiful. Now whether or not, and this is the issue with these kinds of assumptions, whether or not that's a socially trained response to the colours of Christmas, for example, that's a whole other level of questioning that is a very valid question. But at this level of the experiment, that question has to come later, and I'll get to that. So this was me saying, oh wow, these colours, they do seem to work together. I look at their mathematical relationships, and they are perfect fifths of each other. So the vibrational frequency of the colour green is the perfect fifth of the vibration of the colour red. So mathematically it is A plus B over AB. It's the 2/3 relationship. It's the golden ratio relationship of between red and red, you get green. And it's like, oh, would you look at that? Who'd have thought that colours that are in perfect fifth wave frequency to each other relationship appear, what I would say, harmoniously, beautiful, connected, yeah? And then I was like, well, what about other colours? What about blue and orange? These colours that I put together, and I'm like, oh wow, these are like, I go back to art literature, oh, these are shown to be colours that are in history put together, they're harmonic colours. I go back to my reference charts and I go, wouldn't you believe it? Blue and orange are perfect fifth relationships. Yellow and purple, perfect fifth relationships. It's really interesting. So that question drove me further. I get back into music then. I wanted to relate this across the electromagnetic spectrum before I then took that into exploring something that was far less easy to come up with objectified scientific questions, like the human experience. Yeah, it's a big jump from one to the other. So, same thing in music. We find that obviously there's perfect fifth relationships. Why we say that they're beautiful and they're harmonic intervals in relationships comes down to, on a mathematical level, the fact that they are Fibonacci based. So they are golden ratio sections. So for example, C, from C of one octave to C of the next octave, the F, that represents this harmonic relationship, yeah? That represents this perfect fifth. And you look at that mathematically, that is exactly the same as if I were to say, think of the relationships in my chart now, C to F would be the same as looking at yellow, dark yellow to dark purple. So it's like, well, the mathematical ratio that defines that in music it works in terms of mathematical ratio that defines that in colour, and the human experience of the sense of beauty and connection of the two of them seems intact. So I thought, well, that's very interesting. My question moved on then into something that was like, well, if that is true, and if we could say that there is this relationship of harmony that seems to be based, or beauty rather, that seem to be based on these golden ratio patterns, then if I were to take that mathematical pattern, that A plus B over AB, the 2/3 ratio, it's a type of average, type of mean. If I was to take that and apply that to something that we know from physics, and I hear the rain getting very loud, something that we know from physics where, in terms of frequency and wavelengths, so the electromagnetic spectrum, what we call octaves is an exact doubling or halving of a set frequency. So if I have a frequency of 100 things per second, whatever it is, whatever the medium of operation is, 100 things per second, if I have another thing that is moving at 200 things per second, 200 things per second is a harmonic of 100 things per second. It is an octave higher. So if this 100 things per second was, and this is just arbitrary, if I said that was the note B in octave 0, then 200 things per second would be the octave B in the next, the note B, tone B in the next octave, and so on. So too would 400 things per second, and 800, and 1600, and 3200, and it just continues to double, and so too in subharmonics, 100 things, 50 things, 25 things, and so on and so on and so on. So what we know is that within one circle, within one disc, in a way, from the start to the finish of that disc, we have to fit no more than a doubling of these frequencies, or no more than a doubling of this relationship. The same thing is true in colour and light. That's why we only have one octave of visible light. If you think about the trailing edge of red, human observable red, all the way up through the colour spectrum to purple, and then the next thing up from purple, we call it ultraviolet, but you could almost call it ultra red. The frequency of that colour that we can't see, that is just above violet, is a perfect doubling of the frequency of the colour red. It is literally an octave. It's one octave in relationship. What we find when we apply the Fibonacci sequence, when we apply the golden ratio and these averages to that circle of any numbers, say between 100 and 200 or 400, 800, whatever it is, between the starting number and the doubling of that number, there is a maximum number of individual points that we can obtain before we end up in the next octave. And when you apply that, the maximum number of points that you can find per octave that are golden ratio points is 12. And by the time you find the 13th point, you're now shifted into the next register, the next octave. And it would be as if we said, well, we can find 12 unique colours in the visible light spectrum, and then the 13th colour moves us into the ultraviolet spectrum. And then one would expect, if that's true in the audible spectrum and in the visible light spectrum, one would expect that we would probably find 12 specific colours in the first octave of the ultraviolet spectrum. Who knows how many octaves there are in the ultraviolet spectrum? Well, that was my next question, was like, ooh, maybe I can map this. And so I come up, and some of you have seen that research work in my other fields. I could come up with literally just a database of all possible known frequency ranges in what the humans call the electromagnetic spectrum for usable purposes, and denote them into octaves, effectively, as if we're listening to them, from C to C to C to C. I know that wasn't octaves, I was just giving an example. No one laughed at me. So what that did, I took that all back into my question about whether there could be a relationship for harmonic connection and therefore also disharmonic interactions on a physical level into Hoshinden as the martial art style. And I said, well, I wonder if that means that I could possibly postulate, how arrogant to do so, that there are 12 unique qualities that can interact within the circle of interaction, within one range of octave. I know that doesn't quite work when talking about octaves for the physical expression, but it's as if saying that maybe if we could consider that there's one complete octave of the potential of movement, or the potential of different ways of moving, or potential of different qualities of movement, that the maximum number of separate phases or qualities that we could find within that circle would be 12. And that's how I came up with 12 phases. That's where that comes from, specifically. It comes from the notion that, like I said, from reverse engineering my research in the audible spectrum and the visible light spectrum and the relationships there mathematically, that if I was going to attempt to map human movement, the emotional experience of human movement, to the emotional experiences of sound and the emotional experiences of human visual response, that it would have to abide by the same rules, and therefore there might be a maximum of 12 unique qualities. That is the basis of how I came up with 12. That's why we're called 12 phases Hoshinden Jutaijutsu. And I might be very wrong. Great, I'm up for that. But this is more, hopefully, a demonstration of the methodology that I followed, how I arrived at that point, and the connections and the threads that join it up. Now, keep in mind that it's a question. It's a scientific attempt, in my own way, to quantify the human emotional experience through movement and then map it to other phenomena, the phenomena of sound and of light, yeah? Or, that's not true, phenomena of the human experience of those things. One of the things that I found fascinating in my research over the years was in relationship to the human ear. So the inner ear and the cochlea is Fibonacci based, so that it's not just an open cavity. The ear doesn't just cavitate in; it spirals, and the relationship of nodes in that spiral match the perfect fifth. So effectively, the ability for the human to hear relationships between tones is due to this spiral shape of the inner ear. If the inner ear was just like a constantly decreasing set cone, then we would be able to hear relationships of pitch and rhythm increasing, but we might not necessarily be able to relate them to each other. We wouldn't be able to say, wow, the tone of A in that octave does sound the same as the tone of A in that octave. It just sounds brighter or deeper. And that tone of A in that octave sounds the same as the tone of A in that octave, but brighter again, So it is, the idea is that the only way that humans can actually have the ability to make that kind of statement, or to even say, if we listen to someone play the piano, and they're playing octaves all the way up, A, and all of a sudden they play a B, and we go, ugh, because it doesn't follow the pattern, The only reason that we consider that there's a pattern is because we can hear in this, the way that we interpret that sound, through the inner ear, is in repeating octaves of Fibonacci relationships, so that we can say that A is in relationship to the other tones of that octave, and because we can hear the increasing beatings that make up octaves, we can also we can pitch kind of relatively where it lives on a ladder of pitch, in terms of from the lowest observable sound to us to the highest observable sound to us. My theory extends, take that into the visible light octave, is that is exactly true in terms of light in relationship to the octaves of the infrared spectrum and the visible spectrum and the ultraviolet spectrum. So that we could say, what if actually there's, let's say there's 3 octaves of infrared. Does that mean that there's such a thing as near infrared red, near infrared orange, near infrared green, for example, and there's also mid infrared red, mid infrared orange, mid infrared green, and far infrared red, far infrared orange, far infrared green, and so on and so on. And the same true in the ultraviolet spectrum. Ultraviolet red, near ultraviolet red, mid ultraviolet red, far ultraviolet red, mid ultraviolet yellow, or near ultraviolet red yellow, mid ultraviolet yellow, far ultraviolet yellow. And if that is the case, would the human emotional experience to being subjected to those vibrations cause the same experience as they are in music? So that does the skin respond to light wave vibration and frequency in the same way? If I have a particular emotional response to the colour red in the visible spectrum, and then I subject myself to, or my guinea pigs, to the exact halving of that frequency, so that I move from visible red to red in the near infrared spectrum. If I subject myself to that experience, infrared panels, carbon filaments specifically tuned to emit that frequency as a monoband, do I begin experiencing emotionally similar kinds of emotional responses as I do when I see the visual colour red? And if I do the same thing in the ultraviolet spectrum, if I take the visible colour red and I double the frequency of that red, and then I expose myself to the near ultraviolet red, of that doubling frequency, is it true again? Do I start experiencing similar emotional effects as I did to looking at the colour red? And then do I replicate that for orange and yellow and green and so on and so on? And could I actually build a chart of human response? This is the question. And that's been an ongoing area of my study. Those of you, I give talks about that area of my study in physics and physics lectures, and that's a whole separate section. And it's an infinite rabbit hole. My interest in taking that back into the martial arts setting was to say, if I find these things are true in all of these other areas of human experience, then could I say with some sense of still conceited assumption, but some sense of evidential curiosity or evidential assumption, that this might also be true physically? So that, and I don't mean physically in terms of the laws of force, or the mechanics of force. I mean physically in terms of the interaction of humans. So that if a human presents with a particular colour, I'm just going to put it out there, I know that it's a far-fetched comment, but if someone grabs me with a particular colour, they grab me with red, and I have an emotional response with red, what happens if I respond with green? And how is that different in terms of evoking emotional responsive dynamics from them compared to if I respond with yellow, or if I respond with orange, or if I respond with burnt red? If I was to change the dynamic, or even if the individual grabs me or pushes me or attacks me with a quality, let's call it blue, just for the sake of this hypothetical, and they're expecting me to respond as orange because that's the counterbalance, what happens if actually I've trained myself to respond with green? Does that change their ability to maintain that stance? And so then it gets into a psychological description and discussion. The question, the theory being like, in terms that make more sense to us, okay, if someone is being aggressive, forward-moving and aggressive towards me, blah, 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 and I train myself to respond to them aggressively back, blah, 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 does that cause a dynamic that evokes emotional responses from both of us that is patternizable? Could I say, when someone like this acts in this way, and I respond like this, 9 times out of 10, recurringly, this is the dynamic that occurs. And obviously, I could come up with certain keywords. A lack of negotiation, meeting an impasse, anger, frustration, various emotional responses. And then could I replicate that pattern and say, if someone meets at this, and I meet in complete cavitation to that, what's the dynamic that causes? Is that replicatable? Can I actually explore, does this cause that? Can I come up with a causality effect? Because this kind of, not being able to objectify this kind of science with just standards, and have a little control. I can't have a control person. It's impossible to take them out of the context. Not being able to find that kind of objectifiable scientific point, then I have to be able to model recurring repetition in the study, in the human physiology, or rather the human psychology, so that I can say 9 times out of 10, or 99 times out of 100, when someone acts like this and the other person responds in this way, these are the emotional effects. And if that's replicatable in such a way that it's almost entirely repeatable, then we can say, well, then potentially there's a model for exploring human interactions and human relationships. Whether or not that's just from a martial art perspective, or even from like an employer-employee perspective, or an interpersonal abuse perspective. Could we even get into would it be possible to even say, when someone acts like this, if you respond, I could draw you a map. Someone says this in this particular way, and they respond, and they're forward moving towards you. It's very aggressive. Well, here's a map of 12 possible responses, emotional, psychological, and here are the pros and cons. If you respond in this way, these are the emotional dynamics that you should expect. And then you choose which of those are you more prepared to live with, which of those is more suited to your natural innate character, which of those do you actually feel is going to be productive and generative towards the goals that you want, and hopefully, ideally, a mutual benefit, yeah? And so my interest all along with this study has been, can these observations of qualities in martial arts move out to be far beyond the physical interaction and actually form a map in human psychology that could be used to almost strategize, sounds really bad, it could be used for good, not evil, strategize the interactions with other people so that you already know what you're getting into. So as soon as someone comes up and goes, blah, 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 in this particular way, I know that when I choose a certain response, I'm fully aware of the probability of the emotional dynamic that will occur, not just for them, but in me. If I respond in this way, it will generate a feeling of confidence. If I respond in this way, it will generate a feeling of despair. If I respond in this way, it will generate a feeling of anger. If I respond in this way, it will generate a feeling of sadness. And almost map that to such a degree that you could just apply it. And I don't mean to put that forward in my interest to suggest that humans are robotic. Simply to suggest that maybe the human emotional response is a response to the mathematical qualities of these kinds of phase relationships. Now, I haven't gone so far as to say fundamentally what that is in terms of materialism. So I haven't said that the emotional responses are electromagnetic, for example, or I haven't said that they are electric or that they are gravitational. Coining the actual medium of human emotion, that's possibly something that's way beyond this research, and also way beyond what I would be prepared to stake my name and reputation to. But just because I know that I would probably be demonstrated to be wrong in 100 years. But at least to the point that I want to be able to come up with a map of repeatable, demonstratable, recurring, progressive observations, and then map that beyond into the entire human emotional experience and say, I can't say why, but this is an effect that I see. I can't clarify how, but these are the mathematical probabilities and the functions that show the statistics of what, yeah? And we get into that function where it becomes a more mathematical thing than it does a thing of physics, where physics should be able to explain phenomena. Mathematics can only describe the effects of phenomena, or not even that. Mathematics can only postulate the probabilities of the effects of those phenomena. Yeah, that the two aren't the same, and this is more an attempt to give some language to like a mathematical approach than it is a physics approach. So I haven't yet found a way to explain why. Yeah. So I'm going to put that there, and hopefully at the end of that, if you followed half of that, you've gained some understanding as to why it is that this is called 12 phases Hoshinden Jutaijutsu, or at least why it is called 12 phases Hoshinden. The Jutaijutsu is referring to Ju, like the number 10, the auspicious, the mystical, the magic, Tai of the body, and Jutsu, the skill, the subject. It's the mystical subject of the body skills, or the mystical, not even that. It's the auspicious skills of the body. What's the word I'm looking for? People have a superstitious. There we go. The superstitious body skills meant on a kind of. I'm not meaning that in a modern term of superstitious meaning paranoid. I mean superstitious, referring to large, like the correct use of the word awe. Nowadays people say, "Oh, it's awesome." I say awesome all the time, but I mean it to mean cool. But 2,000 years ago, awesome meant terrifying, terror. You're in awe. You're overwhelmed with awe. Gods were awesome, A can of soft drink wasn't awesome. That was just, a drink. That's just a drink. Someone's skateboarding activity isn't awesome by the actual nature of the word. It's just cool, whatever. Oh, that's very talented. If it was awesome, then as they did the skateboarding technique, lightning bolts would shoot them dead from the sky. That would be awesome. That would be terrifying. So I mean Jutaijutsu Ju in terms of that concept of the mystical number 10, the superstition of number 10 in that context of greatness, or like transcendentalist. So 12 phases is referring to how I come up with the assumption, probably the conceited assumption, that there are 12 fundamental points within each, 12 fundamental nodes within each circle and cycle, based using the golden ratio to apply that mathematics to a circle, to a cycle, and then find those points, and then attempt to map names and keywords and functions of qualities to those 12 nodes. So they're not just an arbitrary node. They actually become alive. They come invigorated. The sense of the fire phase, and it carries with it all of these connotations, all these emotions that are very different to when I say the water phase. And like I said in the last week's video, the previous one, that the mistake that I probably made was naming those phases with their elemental terminologies, because I know that what I've done is I've confused probably many of you into thinking that the element itself is the fundamental of that quality. So that, for example, the element of water, insofar as we understand that in our Western culture, is the pinnacle definition of the water quality, when in reality what I meant was water as a manifestation in our experience is it's a manifestation of that quality. Water isn't the pinnacle of that quality. Water is a manifestation of that in exactly the same way as molten lava is, in exactly the same way as liquid methane is. But it's not called the liquid methane phase. Yeah? It's not called the molten lava phase. So what I actually intend to do long term, I have no idea when I will get around to this, but at some point I will replace all 12 of those names with completely arbitrary, abstract English words that I will invent. They have to be, because I can't have them tied to previously connotated English words. So I will literally invent 12 new terms, and I will name the qualities of those 12 terms, and I will then use the elements as keywords and descriptives. They're called descriptors. I've talked about this in my writings. So that water will become a descriptor of the quality of blah, blah, blah. Yeah? Fire will become a descriptor of the quality of blah, blah, blah. It will become a manifestational keyword. In the same way that when we talk about fire phase, at this point in time, what come with it are qualitative keywords such as like forward moving or engulfing or upward lifting. And those are emotionally qualitatively charged keywords that I'm attempting to use to build the idea of the quality, because I don't have the word for the quality. And so it runs into that problem, trying to name this thing using all the other names. And eventually I know that I'll need to just come up with a word. And when that happens, you will probably find that I'll start using it in class and annoy you all. But, too bad. To wrap that up in that section, moving on from my discussion about how, from last week, initially there were 4 fundamentals, merging that with my pattern of 12 nodes per cycle, coming up with 12 qualities, and I had 4 qualities. One of the very difficult questions I had then was, of the 4 qualities that I already have, earth, fire, wind, and water, A, where are they in the cycle of 12 qualities? And B, what are the other qualities? Uh-oh. That's a really difficult question. That took years. When I first started to postulate the 12 phases theory, that probably came into a really solid, workable framework in around late 2015, maybe. It really took me another, I'd say, 2 or 3 years before I'd decided that I was happy with where I'd placed the 4 primary qualities in relationship to that cycle, based on a whole bunch of my other research and in the emotional quality that they evoked, and putting them in relationship to sound and colour, in terms of, well, the colour red, what kind of emotional quality does that evoke generally? The tone, or the key of G, what kind of emotional response does that evoke generally? Which of the 4 primary elements evoked emotional qualities that were close to the qualities of the key of G and the qualities of the colour red? And then I would map that earth quality into the cycle and have almost like a fixed position in the wheel where to place it. As if you could imagine the 12 qualities, not in a wheel, not in a cycle, but in a linear pattern. Imagine like a keyboard, a piano octave, and I place earth there. And then the question is like, okay, well then I can probably arbitrarize the positions and the placements of, if earth and wind are complementary and they're opposites of each other, well then maybe that means that I could say, well, the perfect fifth of earth is wind. Yeah? So does that mean that wind gets placed opposite earth in the circle? And that was what I had to do to start building, and I had just my desks, my work at the dojo, at home, my studios were just filled with paper, scraps of paper and butcher's paper, trying to draw and understand and map out my working as I went along, and attempting to fit these models together, these 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, and completely arbitrary, like non-dimensional, internal experiential models into a map. It's very, very difficult, I have to say. And I'm actually very damn proud of the job. I'm pointing over here because I can see the wheel on the door that I'm looking at, the colour wheel. So that process helped me to place and position the 4 primary elements in relationship to each other, using the emotional responses and the experiences that I generalized from the audible spectrum and the visible light spectrum. Then the next question was like, well, what fills in the gap? Because now I've got 4 node points. This is a 12 nodal point theory. I've got 8 nodal points that I don't have any words for. I don't even have any reference for them. All I have now is a relativism of 4 fundamental points. So I know that I've got a gap of 2 node points between each of them in the circle, but I don't know what they are. And those of you who remember what came next from that, the next evolution of that in my thinking was, okay, we go from 4 to 8. Let's look at 8 qualities. And initially it was like, well, this was just simply the next step I had to take. If I know that I've got some gap between the earth quality and the wind quality, and then I find that between them I've also got the fire and water qualities. I'm just doing this to map the circle. Then I could say, well, between the earth quality and the fire quality, there's a gap that's unknown. What if I just filled that gap as one thing to start with, and then I'll subdivide it later? So instead of 12, let's go from 4 to 8. So I say, well, here's earth and here's fire. If I was to find the edge of those, what would the qualities of that be? If I were to look at, so in terms of the color spectrum, that's like saying, if I take red and yellow, what is in the middle? I'm like, oh, orange. Orange is in the middle. Okay, cool. Orange is between those nodal points. So I go back, and then I say, okay, orange. And let's have a look. It's got to be movement. It's got to be qualities that are evoked that are the boundary and the edging between the extremes of earth phase concepts and keywords and the extremes of fire phase. And what I started to develop was the concepts of metal, things that were structured. So earth carries with it a whole bunch of qualities of substance and structure, triangles and solidity. By contrast, fire carries with it concepts that are forward-moving and lack substance and lack structure completely. So I was like, wow, maybe the midpoint between them, the nodal point that's there, in this 8 pattern between earth and fire, would be something which is able to be forward-moving and directional, driving, penetrative, but has structure and can cause penetration. Fire has to burn around something. It doesn't burn through the center, yeah? By itself, by its given nature. It doesn't penetrate in that way. It erodes. Whereas I was like, well, what kind of things do we have that manifest in our earth experience that they are filled with structure and substance, they are structural and substantial, and yet they can have the devastating forward-moving effects of fire. And I started to imagine that perhaps metal was a manifestation, a descriptor of something, some manifestation which exemplified the quality of a phase that allowed substance to move forward, something of great structure and solidity to penetrate. I was like, oh, yeah, it sounds like metal. Let's go through and let's start fleshing out the concepts of metal. And it's in this way, I did this for each of them by filling in the gaps in this from 4 to 8 concept, and ended up with what I called the secondary elements, the secondary phases. So we've got the phases of metal, lightning, clay, and mist. So it was like, okay, but that only takes me to, that's if I look at them in extreme points, that only takes me to 8. And my theory is a circle filled with 12 nodal points. So if I say, well, let's divide this out again, I've still got spaces. And the next question is like, damn, Now I've got this primary and secondary, but I'm still missing 4 nodal points. I know now that they have to exist in each relationship. So I know that what I'm missing is, it's not like all 4 of those nodal points are missing at the end of the spectrum. I know that it's like, for example, I've got red and kind of like, I've got like dark red and light red. I've got kind of, what I want now is orange. Or I've got red, and I've got burnt orange, but I don't have orange. But then I've got yellow, and then I've kind of got very olivey, greeny yellow, but I don't actually have green. And so I had these gaps missing in my wheel. And it was then that I just started looking, okay, well, if I was to further divide these into subsections, to say, rather than the extremes of metal being right between the two, I thought, well, if I was to place metal closer to the earth quality than to the fire quality, because of its substance, what manifestations then in the earth around me could be used to describe things, a quality that is closer to fire than earth, is more close to fire. So if I've got earthy qualities here and fiery qualities here, and we say that metallic qualities are over here, they are fiery in nature more than earth, but they're still very substantial. It was like, well then, what's this one? What's this quality here? What still has structure and substance, but forgoes those in a way that becomes much closer to fire, to its kind of like vaporousness, yeah, in its destruction. And that's when I started to come up with the idea of, well, perhaps what if I called that phosphor? What if that was something that was spontaneously ignitable? What if that was something that had structure but had the ability to become engulfing, but it wasn't necessarily permanently engulfing? It was like, oh, and then that's how I came up with that coin for the first of the tertiary phases, what I call the tertiary, the third part of the wheel, the phosphor phase. And so then we end up with the tertiary phases of phosphor, thunder, fog, and tar. And all of these words are terrible. Like they're just words that I grabbed of things that were examples of physical manifestations of these qualities as I saw them, of the keywords, of the emotional response of those qualities, and me grabbing at English words that already exist, of English phenomena and manifestations, to attempt to try to point. It's lots of pointing signposts to something that's just a ball, but I don't have a word for it. So we end up with the primary, secondary, and tertiary phases. And I talked about this a lot. And one of the things that then I explored mathematically was the relationship of those phases. Because we're talking about circles and cycles, well, I know that, for example, I could say, and the scientist within me, the relationship from the earth phase, the relationship of the earth phase and the wind phase is a 180-degree relationship. If we put that into a circle, they are polar opposites of each other. They negate each other. And I've explored that. A lot of you guys have explored physically with me how if you take, and this is how, and I wrote the kata to do this on purpose, that's not true. I wrote the kata in a way that then when I tested them, this is what occurred. And it had to occur this way in order to validate this part of my theory, that the earth kata quality and the wind kata quality should negate each other so that neither of them can win. And that's exactly what happens. And the interesting thing was like, that's the way it should happen. That's the way that water kata and fire kata work, and mist kata and metal kata. Because they're 180-degree polarized, and that they are literally the opposite ends of the one stick to each other, they shouldn't be able to gain the upper hand. They should negate. So I knew that they have a 180-degree relationship. That means that the indeterminate phases have a 90-degree relationship. So I could say, amazing. The primary relationships are 90-degree opposed. Earth has a 90-degree relationship to fire, which has a 90-degree relationship to wind, which has a 90-degree relationship to water. So I can then say that earth and fire and water are 90-degree opposed. The two 90-degree oppositions will relate to earth in a similar way, but earth and wind will just oppose each other. And then rotate, it's exactly the same. Fire has a 90-degree relationship to wind and earth, and 180 degree relationship to water. So fire and water will oppose each other. Fire and earth and fire and wind will interact with each other in similar fashions because they are both at 90 degree relationships. I did this, I should say, all of the primary relationships are at 90 degree opposed. All of the secondary relationships to each other are 90 degree opposed. So that the metal kata is the metal phase rather is 90 degree opposed to the lightning phase, which is 90 degree opposed to the mist phase, which is 90 degree opposed to the clay phase. And again, the metal phase and the mist phase are 180 degree opposed, and the lightning phase and the clay phase are 180 degree opposed. So that in their little section, they're relatable. And the same is true of the tertiary, such that the phosphor phase is 90 degree opposed to the thunder phase, which is 90 degree opposed to this is so many words, to the fog phase, 90 degree opposed to the tar phase, such that phosphor and fog are 180 degrees apart and negate, and that thunder and tar are 180 degrees and negate. And then placing the 3 layers onto the one wheel to come up with the 12 nodal points. What I then was able to say, and I think some of you might remember this from my sketches maybe a year or two ago, was that, okay, the relationship between earth and fire is a 90 degree opposition. The relationship between earth and phosphor is a 60 degree opposition. The relationship between earth and metal is a 30 degree opposition. And I was able to divide these into slices and make scientific assumptions that the effects, the physical effects, the emotional responses and dynamics that occur in relationship from earth to metal will be much closer, that they will maintain, what am I trying to say? They will have a smaller, more narrow, more contained outcome than the effects of earth to fire, for example. So that it will build to an extreme, so that if earth and metal are very close to each other, even by angle of degree in relationship on the circle, then does that mean that I could say that physically, literally, tangibly, in martial art, get up, punch each other, does that mean that really solid earthy ways of moving, when they meet really metallic ways of moving, the fallout is going to be very little compared to the fallout of when an earthy way of moving meets a fiery way of moving? And is that going to be different compared to the fallout of an earthy way of moving compared to a windy way of moving? And that's the question that I've been slowly exploring. And the entire Hoshinden syllabus, the colour belt syllabus, is built to ask that question and explore through tangible movement the actual answer to that. And what I have found is that yes, each of these, they relate in these ways, and that the pattern, that the theory stands insofar as I can demonstrate the physical interactions, and I can use that as a kind of a compass to point to my theory that these nodal points or these qualities are an appropriate way of distributing and then mapping, and therefore as a tool to use the possible interaction of humans with other humans, and the possible interaction of humans with anything else in the universe that manifests in that way for those qualities. So that the interaction of the human body against something of literal earth manifestation, if you run at a wall, and if we could quantify what the human being, let's say that the human probably, like the physical flesh, I haven't thought this far in this yet, this is just off my cuff, this exact example. If we say that the human flesh has a closer relationship to the water and clay phases, that when the human runs at a wall, the physical force relationship of the human body meeting the wall the qualities of the wall in relationship with the qualities, like the qualities of hardness and density of the wall in relationship with the qualities of suppleness and mutability of the physical flesh, mean that the wall should maintain its position and I should bounce away from the wall, either at 90 degrees or 180 degrees opposed. It should be absolutely impossible on a physical level for the body, the human body, to penetrate the wall unless the human body was made of a manifested quality like metal that is so close to that it has the ability, it has the substance to actually make that effect. So hopefully I'm able to make that clear. I get very excited. I don't know if my words really necessarily carry my thoughts correctly. That what Hoshinden is an opportunity to find out through martial arts if these are standard ways of relating, and if they are, then this is a global strategy for the individual. I don't mean global in terms of the world. I mean that just to say applicable. It's a form of strategy that you can take with you anywhere, into any circumstance, into any form of dialogue and discussion. You can take it and you can look at your relationship with your boss, and then you can make decisions and strategies based on that. You can take it and you can apply it to your scientific research, and you can make hypotheses and strategies out of that. You can take it and you can apply it to music and art and creativity, and you can formulate and create a whole myriad of different expressions because of that. So I hope, because I'm just looking at the clock and it's actually like 10 minutes past, I hope that any of that was, you followed along with any of that with my thoughts. Also, I hope that if you were able to follow, that you have found these things to be true as well. And I'd be fascinated in the comments of the post for you to write up about that. Like, let me know. Is any of what I said tonight reflective of your personal experience? Is any of what I said tonight reflective of how you found that you can study physical form and movement, and then by sheer magic, by almost mystical experience, you find yourself in an argument with someone, and it's almost as if you have some understanding of the strategy, of a strategy that you could take, and maybe you can explore that. Let me know how you go. Let me know how that's been. Let me know how the last decade of exploring this with me has been, because I'm fascinated by this, and I continue to explore, and this is my role. I'm the head of the style. This is my role, and I hope that it's been of benefit and wonder. I hope that it continues to be of benefit and wonder. And I'd be really keen to hear about your experiences. So I'll leave it there. I wish you all an awesome weekend and a lovely week. I'll see you on Wednesday. Happy birthday, Reigning Spirit Dojo. As a birthday present to the dojo and to all of you, I took an audio recording of me reading The Prophet from Khalil Gibran in 1927, and I've posted that up on the page. It's a 1 hour and 16 minutes, I think, but it's effectively an audiobook. I'm narrating, I'm reading and recording The Prophet. For all of you who don't have a copy of that book, I highly recommend it. It's there now, you can have a listen, and I'm going to start putting up more of those audio recordings. I've got some more things to read for you. So lots of love, have a fantastic week, and I will see you soon.